You won't believe what I'm about to tell you. Because when I first lived through it, even I couldn't believe it was happening to me. Imagine sitting in a courtroom, your entire life hanging in the balance, your reputation being decided, not just by strangers but by the very people who were supposed to love and protect you. Now imagine that the one person you thought would fight for you, your own mother, was standing up, pointing at you, and declaring to the world, she can barely hold a job, she's unreliable, she's careless. I felt my chest tighten as those words left her lips, and for a moment, I wondered if I had heard wrong, if my brain was distorting reality under pressure. But no, the silence in the courtroom confirmed that everyone had heard exactly what I had, and their eyes, those heavy eyes, were now fixed on me as though I had just been unmasked as a fraud. The prosecutor smirked slightly, clearly delighted that my own mother had handed him the weapon he needed, while my defense attorney froze, unsure of how to combat testimony that was meant to protect me but instead tore me down. I tried to breathe, but every inhale felt like I was pulling shards of glass into my lungs. This wasn't just a case anymore. This was a betrayal that went deeper than any scar I had ever carried. My mind rushed back to my childhood, the sacrifices I had made, the late nights spent working 2 jobs just to help my family keep a roof over our heads, and the countless times I had defended my mother's honor when neighbors whispered cruel things about her. All of that loyalty, all of that love, collapsed into dust with one sentence. Yet, strangely, as devastating as it felt, I also sensed the courtroom wasn't done with me, because at the far end of the hall, behind his bench, the Chief Justice had shifted in his chair, leaning forward, his face tightening with a seriousness that made everyone stop breathing. He tapped his gavel once, and the echo silenced even the whispers. The moment his eyes landed on me, I knew something was coming, something that would either shatter me completely or resurrect me in a way I couldn't imagine. My mother's words still stung in my ears, but it was his voice, deep and unwavering, that soon cut through the tension like a blade. And that was the moment my story truly began, because what he said next would flip the entire courtroom upside down, leaving even my mother staring wide-eyed in disbelief. The Chief Justice slowly rose from his seat, his robes falling around him like heavy curtains, and every single person in that courtroom turned rigid, as though the air itself had frozen mid-breath. His face wasn't just stern, it was unreadable, the kind of expression that left you wondering if he was about to condemn you or protect you. I clutched the edge of the defense table, my fingers trembling so hard they left tiny half-moon indents against the wood. My attorney leaned closer, whispering that I shouldn't react, that no matter what my mother said, I had to keep my composure. But how could I when my own flesh and blood had just painted me as incompetent in front of the nation's highest authority? I wanted to scream, to cry, to stand up and shout about all the nights I came home exhausted from a double shift just so my younger siblings could eat, about all the times I was the only one to patch up the holes in our lives when my mother herself had given up, but my throat betrayed me. No sound came out, and then, in the silence that seemed to stretch like eternity, the Chief Justice's voice rang out, strong and deliberate. She's been through battles that none of you in this room could survive. She's been carrying weight that would break most men. The gasp that swept across the courtroom was almost audible, a wave of shock that passed over every juror, every spectator, even the prosecutor who had been so sure he had the upper hand. My mother's face shifted, confusion first, then disbelief, and then something colder, almost like fear. I didn't understand how the Chief Justice knew what I had endured, how he could possibly speak so intimately about the struggles that had nearly broken me. His words cut deeper than my mother's accusation, but in a different way. They cut open wounds I had buried, exposing them to the world, yet at the same time, they wrapped those wounds in recognition, in validation I had never been given before. The people in the audience leaned forward, some murmuring, some wide-eyed, as if they were watching a story far bigger than a simple legal case unfold before them. My hands were still shaking, but now it wasn't just from fear, it was from the weight of a truth I hadn't expected to surface in this cold, marble-walled room. I thought back to when I was 16, balancing school and 3 part-time jobs after my father left, my back aching every night but my pride refusing to let me stop. I thought of the countless applications I sent out, the endless cycle of being hired and then forced out, not because of incompetence but because I had to miss shifts to care for my siblings, or because someone higher up wanted to replace me with someone cheaper. My mother knew all of that. She had watched me collapse on the floor from exhaustion. She had accepted the money I slipped into her hands when bills were overdue, and yet here she was, painting me as unstable and incapable, just to distance herself from me. The Chief Justice's words didn't just contradict her testimony, they shattered it. And in that moment, as his voice filled the hall, I realized this case wasn't just about proving my innocence or my worth in the eyes of the law. It was about something far greater, exposing the truth about who I really was, about what it means to survive when the world seems determined to crush you, and about whether love from family is genuine or conditional. The silence after his statement was deafening, but it wasn't the silence of indifference, it was the silence of a collective audience waiting for the next strike in a battle that had only just begun. That as the weight of the Chief Justice's words sank into the walls of that courtroom, I felt a strange current running through me, like someone had finally cracked open the cage I had been locked inside for years. The jury's eyes, which only minutes ago seemed to judge me through the lens of my mother's testimony, now shifted with a flicker of doubt, of reconsideration. I could almost hear their thoughts turning over, reshaping, as though the narrative they had been handed was beginning to crumble in their hands. My mother, however, wasn't ready to give up her hold. She adjusted the scarf draped over her shoulders, her lips pursed tightly, and she leaned forward as if ready to strike back. With more venom, her gaze found mine across the courtroom, and for the first time, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. Not disappointment, not sadness, but resentment, raw and unmasked. I wanted to ask her silently, why? Why would you do this to me after everything? But her eyes gave no answer. Only a wall of coldness that seemed older than the trial itself. Suddenly, I was dragged back in memory 2 nights when I was no more than a child, standing in the corner of our tiny kitchen while my mother argued with creditors on the phone, her voice rising, her hands shaking, and when she hung up, she would turn those stormy eyes on me, as though I had caused the debts, as though my existence was another burden on her shoulders. I remembered how she once told me I was too much to handle when I was only 9, and yet, at that same age, I was the one ironing my younger brother's school uniform and packing lunches because she had disappeared for the night. The years blurred together into a cycle of survival, and though I didn't have the words back then to name it, I now recognized that she had carried bitterness toward me for being a constant reminder of the responsibility she never wanted to shoulder. And now here she was, using the trial as her grand stage to release that bitterness in front of strangers, hoping it would bury me. But what she hadn't expected was for the Chief Justice himself to step into the space between us, to pierce through her carefully built facade and give voice to truths I thought nobody had seen. His words, "She's been through battles that none of you in this room could survive," replayed in my head like a lifeline, giving me the strength to stand upright even as my mother's shadow loomed larger. The prosecutor, sensing his case slipping, tried to interject, reminding the court that family testimony carried weight, because who knows you better than your own mother? The smugness in his tone made my blood boil, but before he could continue, the Chief Justice's gavel struck the bench, sharp and decisive, silencing him midst. "Do not assume blood is the only measure of truth," he declared, his eyes narrowing on the prosecutor before flicking briefly to my mother, who flinched as though she had been caught in a lie. The spectators leaned in, hungry, caught in the tension of a story that seemed less like law and more like revelation. I sat there, breathing slowly now, no longer fighting tears but embracing the clarity that came with them. For the first time in years, I felt like the world was hearing me not through my own broken pleas but through the undeniable authority of someone who saw the scars beneath my silence. Still, I knew this was only the beginning, because my mother was not the type to back down quietly, and I could almost feel her preparing to unleash something darker, something she had kept hidden. In her desperate attempt to twist the story back into her favor, the silence that followed was like a heavy curtain, but I could feel my mother sharpening her words behind it, preparing to tear apart the fragile balance the Chief Justice had just restored. She cleared her throat softly, a rehearsed gesture she always used before speaking in public. And for a fleeting second I was transported back to school meetings where she would put on that polished, respectable face for teachers, hiding the chaos of our home. Now, she wore that same mask, and I knew what was coming, a calculated attack, disguised as truth. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, almost too steady. "With all due respect, you don't know what it's like to live with her. Yes, she may look like she works hard, But you haven't seen the pattern. She takes jobs, she gets sympathy, but she never lasts. There's always an excuse, someone else to blame, some struggle to point to. She hides behind hardship. Her words were venom wrapped in silk, and though they stung, they also revealed something deeper, her need to control the story, to strip me of credibility so she could remain the martyr in her own narrative. My attorney shifted beside me, furious but restrained, whispering that we'd have our chance to respond. But the Chief Justice didn't wait. He leaned forward, his eyes piercing through her carefully crafted performance, and said, "Tell me, ma'am, where were you when she was 17, walking home from 2 jobs after midnight? Where were you when she skipped meals so her siblings could eat? Where were you when she collapsed from exhaustion?" The courtroom gasped, heads turning, whispers rising like wind through dry leaves. My mother's face cracked for the briefest moment, her lips twitching, her eyes darting, as if she had not expected anyone, let alone the Chief Justice, to hold up a mirror to her neglect. I felt tears sting the corners of my eyes, not just from the validation but from the shock of hearing someone finally acknowledge the invisible battles I had fought alone. Flashbacks rushed in, me at 16, sitting on a dimly lit bus with my uniform wrinkled, clutching the envelope of cash I had earned just so my family could have electricity for another month. Me scrubbing floors at dawn before rushing to class, trying to stay awake while my teachers scolded me for dozing off. Me handing my mother rent money while she criticized me for being distracted in school. And yet, despite all of that, she was now standing here, dismissing it all as weakness, painting me as unreliable. I wanted to scream, to confront her with every memory, but the Chief Justice's gaze held me steady, reminding me that my silence was no longer weakness, it was proof. Because he was doing what I had prayed for years someone would, speaking the truth I had buried. The prosecutor fumbled with his papers, clearly thrown off, and the jury's expressions began to shift, sympathy softening their eyes. Still, my mother pressed on, desperation leaking through her polished tone. "She exaggerates," she insisted, her voice growing sharper. "Yes, she's worked, but so do millions. Struggle doesn't excuse failure. She could never keep stability. She could never." She stopped mid-sentence when the Chief Justice's gavel cracked like thunder, silencing her instantly. His voice dropped low, deliberate. "Or perhaps she could never rely on you." The words landed like a stone in a still pond, the ripples spreading through the courtroom, shaking the foundation of everything my mother had tried to build. My chest tightened, but this time it wasn't from fear, it was from the slow, powerful realization that the truth was no longer trapped inside me. It was being spoken aloud, undeniable, and the walls of my mother's false testimony were crumbling, brick by brick, before everyone's eyes. The silence after the Chief Justice's thunderous words lingered like smoke after a fire, heavy and impossible to ignore. My mother's composure faltered, her lips pressed together, her eyes darting as though searching for an escape route in a room where every door had been locked. But I knew her too well to think she would surrender. She had always been the kind of woman who, when cornered, would double down, weaving new lies from thin air. If the old ones unraveled, she steadied herself, inhaled, and began again, her tone sharper, less refined this time. "You think you know her, Your Honor, but you don't. You don't know what it's like to live under the same roof. She's reckless. She's selfish. Every time something goes wrong, she plays the victim. She'll tell anyone who will listen about her so-called sacrifices. But she won't tell you about the nights she abandoned her siblings to go chase after her own life. She left me to pick up the pieces." Her voice cracked slightly on the last sentence, but she quickly masked it with indignation. My stomach twisted. Her words weren't just distortions, they were daggers, aimed to cut me down in front of everyone. My attorney shifted in his seat, whispering that we should object, but I shook my head faintly. For some reason, I didn't want to interrupt her. I wanted the court to hear every word, every falsehood. Because I sensed something building, a storm gathering behind the Chief Justice's silence. He didn't interrupt her this time. He let her continue, his eyes locked on her with a stillness that was more terrifying than anger. "She can't hold a job because she doesn't care enough to try." My mother pressed on, her voice rising with false conviction. "She drags people down with her mistakes. She always finds a way to make someone else responsible. I've seen it her whole life. She's a disappointment, Your Honor. She's not who you think she is." The jury looked torn, some skeptical, others sympathetic, but the weight in the room was undeniable. I clenched my fists beneath the table, biting the inside of my cheek to stop myself from crying out. All I could think about were the countless times I had skipped teenage parties, skipped sleep, skipped any sense of a normal life to keep our fragile family from collapsing, abandoned my siblings. I had raised them when she walked away for nights, for weekends, when she drowned herself in her own regrets. Reckless. I had been the one calculating grocery money down to the last cent. The one sewing my brother's shoes back together when we couldn't afford new ones. The one dragging myself out of bed at dawn after working until midnight just to make sure breakfast was on the table. Selfish. My entire youth had been carved into sacrifice, and yet, here she was, rewriting history in front of strangers. But then the Chief Justice moved. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned forward, his hands resting on the bench, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but sharper, like a blade sliding through the dark. Tell me, then, who paid the overdue rent when the landlord came knocking? Who covered the hospital bills when your youngest was sick? Who bought food when there was none in your house? My mother's face froze, her throat bobbing as she swallowed hard. The room grew unbearably tense, the jury staring at her now, not me, waiting for her answer. She stammered. I managed. I found a way. But the Chief Justice pressed on, his eyes narrowing, his words relentless. Or did she, at 17, at 18, at 19, carry the weight you should have carried as a mother? The truth hung there, impossible to deny. My mother's shoulders slumped ever so slightly, and for the first time, she looked small. Not defeated yet, but small. And then, in a desperate attempt to turn the tide, she lashed out with something I had never expected her to reveal in public. Her voice trembled with fury as she spat. She wasn't the saint you all think she is. She lied about her father. She lied about why he left. She made him go. Your Honor, she pushed him away. The gasp that erupted in the courtroom was deafening. My heart stopped, my breath caught, and for a moment, I wasn't in that courtroom anymore. I was a little girl again, standing in the hallway, hearing the front door slam as my father walked out for the last time. My mother's words had unleashed a secret I had buried deep, a wound I never wanted exposed, and the pain of it surged through me like fire. But even as I shook, even as the ground beneath me felt like it was splitting, the Chief Justice's voice came again, steady and firm, anchoring me. No parent leaves because of a child, he said, his eyes locked on my mother, and no child should carry that blame. His words were like a shield thrown across me, protecting me from the venom she had unleashed, and I felt the tears I had been holding back spill freely now, not out of weakness, but out of the crushing weight of years of lies, finally being challenged in the open. The words, she pushed him away, clung to the air like poison, seeping into every corner of the courtroom, and I could feel the jury's eyes darting between me and my mother, as though they were suddenly staring at a family drama far deeper than the trial itself. My chest burned, my throat tightened, and all I could think of was the last night I saw my father's shadow disappear beyond our broken front gate. I was barely 13, standing barefoot in the doorway, clutching the hem of my oversized nightshirt, begging him not to leave. His shoulders had been heavy, his voice cracked when he told me to be strong, and then he walked away without looking back. For years, my mother fed me the same narrative. He was weak, he abandoned us, he didn't care enough. And now, in this courtroom, she flipped it, weaponizing his absence to frame me as the cause, as though my existence had been too much for him to handle. My stomach twisted violently, and it took every ounce of strength not to collapse under the weight of her accusation. My attorney placed a gentle hand on my arm, whispering that we didn't have to answer that it wasn't relevant, but he didn't understand. For me, it was everything. The Chief Justice's eyes narrowed, his silence deliberate, his posture radiating authority. He allowed the whispers to swell, to buzz through the courtroom like electricity, before striking his gavel once. The sound silenced even the faintest rustle of paper. Enough, he said firmly. We are not here to assign the sins of parents to their children. His words were clear, powerful, but I saw something in his eyes that told me he wasn't finished. He turned slowly toward my mother, his expression unreadable. If you want to bring up her father, he continued, his voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel, then let us speak honestly. Where was he pushed, and why? The entire courtroom seemed to lean forward, waiting, because the question hung with an implication that my mother's story wasn't the full truth. My mother stiffened. Her hands twisted the hem of her scarf, Her eyes darted nervously. He left because he couldn't handle her, she insisted, but her voice lacked the steadiness it carried before. She was too much, too demanding, always needing, always wanting. He couldn't stand the pressure. Her words were brittle, breaking under the weight of her desperation. And for the first time, I saw cracks in the armor she had worn my entire life. My heart pounded painfully in my chest, but somewhere beneath the pain, there was a flicker of hope, because I wasn't the only one hearing those cracks. The jury was seeing them too. The Chief Justice didn't move, didn't blink, but his voice lowered into a tone so sharp it was almost terrifying. Or perhaps he left because he could no longer endure you, he said, his gaze locking on my mother with a force that made her flinch visibly. Gasps rippled through the room, the prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, and even my attorney froze, wide-eyed, as though the Chief Justice had spoken words no one expected. My mother opened her mouth to retort, but no sound came. Her throat tightened, her face flushed red, and I realized in that moment that he knew something deeper than even I did. The air was thick with it, the unspoken truth circling the room like a predator. And then, as though he had been waiting for this precise moment, the Chief Justice spoke again. I've read the testimonies, I've seen the reports. His voice carried the weight of knowledge, undeniable and terrifying. She was the one holding your family together while you fell apart. She was the one patching the wounds you left unattended. And as for her father, not dare to twist that story. He didn't leave because of her. He left because he could no longer endure your bitterness, your cruelty. The words detonated in the air, an explosion of truth that shattered the fragile mask my mother had worn. Gasps and murmurs filled the courtroom, the sound of collective disbelief at what was being unveiled. My mother shook her head violently, her voice breaking as she shouted, "That's not true, that's not true." But the tremble in her voice betrayed her, and the courtroom knew it. For me, it was like the ground had split open beneath me, not in terror this time, but in release. All those years of guilt, of carrying the silent burden that maybe I had driven my father away, melted into tears streaming uncontrollably down my face. My breaths came in jagged sobs, not of shame, but of relief that finally, someone had spoken the truth aloud. The Chief Justice's voice softened, his words directed at me now, almost like a father's tone. You are not to blame for his absence, and you are not defined by her lies. I broke then, my shoulders shaking, my hands covering my face, because I had never in my life heard anyone say those words to me. For the first time, the crushing weight I had carried for more than a decade began to lift. And, as the jury watched, as the courtroom leaned into the unraveling story, I realized this trial wasn't just about legal judgment. It was about unmasking the truth of my entire life. And the truth was finally breaking free. The courtroom was no longer just a hall of law. It had become a stage where decades of buried pain, betrayal, and truth were unraveling in front of strangers, who now leaned forward as though witnessing the final act of a tragedy they could never forget. My mother, once so composed, now trembled visibly, her eyes wild, her voice breaking as she tried to salvage the story she had spun. "She's manipulating you," she cried out, pointing at me with a hand that shook uncontrollably. "She's making herself look like the victim, but she's not. But her words fell flat, hollow, echoing against walls that no longer held her power. The jury's faces had hardened, not with judgment toward me, but with disapproval toward her, as if they had finally seen through the disguise she had worn for years. My own chest rose and fell in rapid breaths, my tears flowing freely, but this time I wasn't ashamed. I let them fall, because every drop carried years of silence, years of carrying blame that wasn't mine to bear. The Chief Justice rose again, his tall figure commanding the room with a presence that silenced even the whispers. His eyes swept over the jury, the prosecutor, my attorney, the spectators, and finally, my mother. When he spoke, his words weren't just sentences, they were verdicts in themselves, etched into the very air we breathed. "I have presided over many cases," he began, his voice steady, resonant, "but rarely do I witness a trial that is less about the law and more about the truth of humanity itself. What we have heard today is not the unreliability of a young woman, but the resilience of someone who bore burdens she was never meant to carry. What we have seen is not instability, but sacrifice that should have been honored, not condemned." His words cut deep, reshaping the atmosphere of the room until even the prosecutor lowered his eyes, his earlier smirk replaced by uneasy silence. Then he turned his gaze to my mother. And for the first time, she could not meet his eyes. You testified that she could barely hold a job, he said firmly. But I say she held something far greater. She held together a family when you did not. She held hope when there was none. She held dignity in the face of exhaustion. And she held responsibility when others abandoned it. That is not failure. That is not weakness. That is strength. The courtroom erupted in a wave of murmurs, some spectators nodding, others whispering with awe, as though the words had struck them personally. My mother shook her head, her voice barely a whisper now. You don't understand. You don't know what it was like. But the Chief Justice silenced her with a single strike of the gavel. What I do understand, he declared, his voice rising, is that your bitterness tried to bury her, but the truth has unearthed her worth. And let it be known today she will no longer be defined by your lies. The finality in his voice hit me like a storm, but instead of crushing me, it lifted me, carried me into a space where for the first time, I felt seen, defended, and free. My sobs came harder, but with them came relief so powerful it shook my very bones. My attorney placed a hand on my shoulder, whispering that I had won more than the Kasai had won back my story. The jury, moved beyond words, nodded almost collectively. Their expressions softened with something like admiration. Even the spectators, strangers who had entered the courtroom indifferent, now looked at me with eyes that carried quiet respect. My mother sank into her seat, her face pale, her shoulders slumped, the fight gone from her at last. As the gavel struck one final time, sealing the moment, the Chief Justice spoke directly to me. His voice no longer just the voice of authority, but the voice of compassion I had longed for my entire life. You are not what they said you were. You are more. And with those words, the trial was no longer just about legality, it became a rebirth, a declaration that the chains of lies and betrayal had finally been broken. I walked out of that courtroom with tears still wet on my face. But for the first time, I felt the weight slide from my shoulders. For the first time, I was free not just in the eyes of the law, but in the truth of who I was. And though my mother's betrayal would forever scar me, I knew now that her words no longer defined me. I carried my own definition, carved not from lies, but from survival, sacrifice, and undeniable strength. And as I stepped into the light outside, the echoes of the Chief Justice's verdict followed me like a promise. I was enough. I had always been enough.